So we'll talk about local regulators first, or local or auto regulation. It's important to understand that auto regulation does um, not affect cardiac output. So it's done by peripheral resistance, not so it's done locally, not globally. So peripheral resistance is adjusted, but cardiac output isn't adjusted. And some local constrictors can be prostaglandins. They're chemicals. Prostaglandins, there are many different prostaglandins released. They're chemicals that just work from cell to cell or in particular tissue areas. The precapillary sphincters can affect local areas. If you remember back to the capillary beds, you have the pre-sphincter and then you have the thorough through channel. And so those can be squeezed off, and so that particular capillary bed has less blood flow to it. If there's less blood flow to a specific capillary bed, it's going to actually increase pressure in other areas. The thing that would cause local regulation to happen is increase or decrease of gases, so whether it be O2 or carbon dioxide. Generally, decreased oxygen, increased carbon dioxide. It makes sense. The tissues aren't getting oxygen. They want more of it. There actually is a buildup of carbon dioxide in the local area. Now, this is just locally. If there's a generation of lactic acid is a byproduct of anaerobic respiration. So that would be a buildup of a waste product. Nitric acid, rising potassium or acidity of areas will affect concentrations in interstitial fluid. Think of anything that would be damaging to tissue that's going to cause local vasodilation. And then the opposite can happen. So if you have local vasodilation, you're going to have blood shunted away from that. Inflammation and elevated temperature. All of these are local autoregulation. There's also hormonal regulation, and then we have a slide of your neural regulation. The big one, and we've talked about this before, it's just kind of a review when we talked about the kidney, is you have a release of renin by those juxtaglomerular cells. Renin causes angiotensin to convert to angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 then is converted to angiotensin 2 in the lungs, and angiotensin 2 then stimulates the release of the antidiuretic hormone via the pituitary gland. That's going to increase your thirst. Not only that, but also promote water absorption across the digestive tract, and also remember it's going to affect the collecting duct of the nephron. So it's going to affect how much water is lost. Antidiuretic hormone. So it's going to actually make sure that more water is kept in by the kidney. But you also have this secretion of aldosterone, because we are basically talking about hormones and their regulation of blood pressure. If you have more blood volume, you're going to increase blood pressure, and that's the idea behind promoting water reabsorption. Aldosterone by the adrenal glands, again, another hormone. Both aldosterone and ADH promote fluid retention. So they work together. If in fact blood pressure falls or oxygen levels are low, then you have your erythropoietin released, and what that does is increases blood volume and improves O2 delivery, because that causes more red blood cells to be created, erythropoietin. Other types of or hormonal type chemicals. You have natriuretic peptides. Those are released from the right atria. They are released in response to the atrial stretch. If blood pressure, if you have a high amount of blood volume, which creates a large pressure amount in that right atrium, it's going to stretch it, and these peptides will be released to cause either the kidney to give off fluid, or for you to basically the thing that can really control fluid level is the kidney to give off fluid. You have these released by the right atria. And then you have a nice flow chart here in case you've forgotten how that renin, angiotensin, aldosterone interplay between those chemicals. In terms of neural reflex, you have carbon dioxide and peripheral resistance are maintained. So peripheral resistance, the reason we're talking about that is vasomotor tone, so neural mechanisms. And the neural mechanisms, so we call them the cardiovascular centers, are located in the medulla oblongata. So put that in your head, cardiovascular centers. You have the cardioacceleratory center, which increases cardiac output, the cardioinhibitory center, which reduces cardio output. All of this in the medulla. Then you also have a vasomotor center, and what that will do is cause constriction or dilation depending on what is being told to do. So with regard to vasomotor center, this again is in the medulla. You have nerves that will respond to the release of norepinephrine, and that will cause vasoconstriction. You also have nerves that respond to a nitric oxide, and that will cause smooth muscle relaxation, so vasodilation. So these are controlled by the medulla. Certainly the nerves are actually innervating the vessels, but the medulla causes the release or the increased level of these two chemicals, norepinephrine and nitric oxide. And then you have reflexes, so that's a nerve impulse, but you also have reflexes. You have baroreceptor reflexes that actually monitor stretch, so how much something is stretching. In the atria, we talked about that a little bit with regard to the natriuretic peptides, looking at volume. This is actually looking at stretch and pressure, I guess you might say. So how much is getting pushed, stretch, not so much stretch, but the pressure against the walls. And then you have chemoreceptor reflexes, which monitor carbon dioxide levels, oxygen, and pH levels. And those reflexes, which when we learned about reflexes, we realized that isn't something that goes to the cortex of our brain, but is something that actually synapses in the spinal cord. You have the impulses, so you have the sensory information coming from these receptors going into the and going across in an intermediate bridge between the sensory neuron, the bridge, and then the motor neuron. So if in fact that's the case in each of these, and what do I want to say, a result needs to take place, an effect needs to take place, that effect can be via vasodilation, vasoconstriction, in terms of baroreceptors. you have those stretch receptors in the walls of the aortic sinuses, the right atrium, and the carotid sinuses. And when blood pressure falls or changes, you have vasoconstriction, vasodilation. And you can think of that with regard to all of them. Monitoring the chemical makeup. If you have a buildup of CO2, what you're going to do is increase respiratory rate, get it out of there, and etc. And then what we have left are some concept maps. This one happens to be the one for baroreceptor reflexes. We can go through this. Again, after you learn about this, so you have normal homeostasis. The baroreceptors at the top part, if the baroreceptors are disturbed because blood pressure rises above normal range, then you're going to have accelerators inhibited, the inhibition center stimulated, and vasomotor centers inhibited. So what that will do is we're slowing the heart rate down, we are vasodilating, and that's going to reduce blood pressure. And this is going to happen unbeknownst to you. And then the opposite with regard to the other direction. And one of the reasons why I went through this, and I have a few of these to show you, is so that you can see how easy it is to study these after you know what's going on. So we'll go through the bottom one also. So if you have a fall in blood pressure, the opposite's going to happen. You have vasomotor centers stimulated, so you have vasoconstriction. You have the inhibition centers, they are shut down. Inhibition, I guess. The inhibition centers, or cardio inhibitory centers, are inhibited. That's kind of a mouthful. And then the cardio acceleratory centers are stimulated, so it increases output. So it has kind of a graphic and shows it. Here's one for the chemoreceptors. Won't go through all of it again, but what you have is an increase of pH. You have, or a decrease of pH. I guess that's what this one is showing you. And then what's going to happen is if you have a decrease of pH, and oxygen levels, elevated CO2. As soon as you see that elevated CO2, you know that the respiratory rate is going to get increased. And the respiratory rate increasing is going to allow hydrogen ions to be breathed out in the form of oxygen, and also carbon dioxide to be exhaled. But in order for that to filter the blood, filter in quotes, you need to increase blood, the heart rate also, and increase vasoconstriction. And then here's the last one, blood pressure and blood volume with regard to these. And again, I'm not telling you you have to use these. I just think that they put all the information in kind of a one image that you can then repeatedly go through and say in your head, okay, if in fact there's a decrease in blood pressure or volume, short term you're going to have this sympathetic activation of increased cardiac output and peripheral vasoconstriction. So that's going to increase blood pressure and blood volume. You have less of it in the capillary beds, so it's going to actually increase the volume. And then long term you have renin released for angiotensin II activation, as well as more blood cells being produced. And then as all of those happen, then you have your not only your blood volume increased, but also the osmotic pressure is going to increase because you have more solutes. And we'll pick this up on the next one.